This is the Toyota Terreno AE86. Starting production in 1983 and ceasing in 87, it released to little fanfare. It wasn't the most powerful car to begin with, and it released in the middle of a Japanese supremacy within the automotive industry that saw Toyota and other Japanese car manufacturers at the top of their game, releasing new models near constantly. The success of its automotive industry was one of the factors leading to Japan's bubble economy, a period of soaring stock and real estate prices within the country that would see them, for a brief period, become the world's largest economy. But as bubbles tend to do, it burst. The Japanese stock market crashed in 1991, leading to Japan's lost decade. A period of economic and social turmoil for the country, with mass layoffs, huge debt and rising crime. One such crime was toge, or mountain pass racing, illegal street races on the long, winding roads of Japan. Groups of youths would compete in unnervingly hazardous feats of speed and turning, a style coined drifting. And it turns out the too old to be cool, too new to be retro Toyota AE86 was the perfect car for those tortuous mountain paths. So, the Terreno became a cult symbol for those young racers and was highly sought after. But, as cult symbols tend to do, it went mainstream. In 1995, Kodansha published the first chapter of Shuichi Shigeno's masterwork, Initial D. Initial D follows teenager Takumi Fujiwara as him and his 8-6 get dragged into the world of toge. Takumi's exploits spawned a flourishingly successful media franchise, including anime adaptations, live-action films, collectibles and clothing, along with introducing not only wider Japanese youth, but also the whole world to toge, drifting and the AE86. Suddenly, this near-forgotten Japan-exclusive Toyota Corolla variant was one of the most fervently sought-after collectible cars in the world. And it would stay that way. I should know, I tracked this one down to be in this video. This is an almost 40-year-old car selling for almost £40,000. A rare occurrence for a non-luxury vehicle. But these prices can be attributed straight back to Shigeno's manga, with many coining the phenomenon the Initial D tax. Now I ain't no car man, and buddy, this certainly ain't no car channel. So believe me when I tell you my interest in the AE86 is bigger than the machine. As a cultural relic, I believe this Terreno represents a phenomenon we're only going to see more of in our current incarnation of the internet. A commodity made for a certain market at a certain time that failed to capture said market in said time, being resurrected and recontextualized years later quite homegrownedly by a group of dedicated individuals far removed from the original target audience. So, isn't it quite fitting that the Toyota Terreno AE86 is the first car the player drives in Racing Lagoon? The 1999 Japanese PlayStation 1 exclusive, Racing Lagoon, is an oddity to say the least, and that's before we even look at its content. The game was developed and published by JRPG powerhouse Squaresoft, just 2 years after the deliverance of their generation-defining opus, Final Fantasy VII. The high attained from the success of FF7 and the funds that came along with it led the company into a period of experimentalism, which would see them toy with new genres in a way they hadn't since their founding, with games such as Parasite Eve, Tobal and Another Mind. Despite delighting in genre hopping post FF7, RPGs were still Square's bread and butter. So with this new spirit of experimentalism, the company decided to merge safety and risk and greenlight Racing Lagoon, dubbing it a high-speed driving RPG. Unfortunately for Square, however, their risk didn't exactly pay off. Racing Lagoon received middling reviews from Japanese game publications at the time of its release, and the game only managed to sell 141,000 copies, a far cry from FF7's 13.3 million. And so, Racing Lagoon was forgotten both by its makers and the wider game-playing population, cast off to be a relic of early 3D game design experimentalism, only ever brought up jokingly by a small number of Japanese game players with astute enough memories to recall its ostentatious writing style and goofy 3D renders. And that would be the end of our story, if it weren't for the internet. The Western obsession with Japanese culture, more commonly and dismissively referred to as weeabooism, is hardly a new phenomenon. All you must know for now is that the wide proliferation of the internet led to previously unparalleled amounts of cultural sharing, not least between Japan and the Americanized West. With the help of the internet, the weeaboo plague spread like wildfire, and as the 90s turned into the 2000s turned into the 2010s, the ease of access to once region-locked content from Japan was growing exponentially, thanks to the hard work of weeaboos worldwide. Some of the most fertile ground for this cultural reinvigoration was found in the world of video games, which up until recently had been pretty much segregated between East and West. There was no guarantee back then that Japanese developed games would be translated and brought to Western markets. Even a large publisher like Squaresoft would only release a fraction of their Japanese titles in America each year, and even less in Europe. So the newly obsessed and internet access granted weeaboo, with even the slightest knowledge of the Japanese language or programming, had an Olympic-sized pool of Japanese exclusive games to discover and perhaps attempt to share with their fellow English-speaking internet users. This practice would come to be known as the fan translation, and would only become more popular as more rarities of Japanese culture resurfaced on Western internet forums, and as the practice of game emulation became more accessible. If we skip to our post-pandemic world, we see that fan translation is bigger than ever, with a large number of Japan-exclusive games from the beginning of the home console market to roughly the 6th generation having been translated by now. Sites such as romhacking.net have translation projects in a wide variety of languages being uploaded near daily. So, it was this frenzied climate that Racing Lagoon would be revived into when on May 24, 2021, little-known ROM hacker and translator Hilltop Works announced in a tweet that he would be the one to lead the charge on finally translating this gem from the 90s. You see, within the 2 decades between the game's release and that tweet, Racing Lagoon slowly underwent a colossal shift in its public perception in both Japan and the West. In its country of origin, Racing Lagoon's writing style and dialogue, that had once been widely mocked by critic and player alike, would begin to gain a meme status, with quotes from the game being shared all over Japanese social media and somewhat ironically recontextualized through the lens of nostalgia. While in the West, a wider interest in Japanese media would begin to take hold, and in the latter half of the past decade, a cult following would begin to take shape around early 3D Japanese video games, especially from the PlayStation 1. Standout figure within this scene was YouTuber ThorHighHeels, who first featured Racing Lagoon in his 2018 video Bizarre Japan-only PS1 games, and would subsequently set off a new ravenous curiosity for the game amongst in-the-know online game enthusiasts. So, By the time Racing Lagoon finally begun getting localised, it was so much more than just some old game, and had taken on a life of its own almost 20 years after its release. Now that you understand Racing Lagoon as a product and the context that surrounds it, we can begin with the analysis. On today's programme, I will guide seasoned racer and curious newcomer alike along a path that shows 3 distinct angles of Racing Lagoon. First, we will see Racing Lagoon as games. Second, as literature. And third, as art. All culminating with a final, ultimate look at Racing Lagoon as revival. I hope you intend to join me down the entirety of this path, as I believe each perspective offers something new to be gained about Racing Lagoon and its cultural impact. Though regardless, please do remember to like and subscribe, along with commenting any thoughts you have during the video. Also, for those of you itching for more content regarding Racing Lagoon post this presentation, I will kindly point you towards the interview I conducted as research for this video with 2 members of the Racing Lagoon fan translation team, Hilltop and Pancake Taicho. You will see snippets of our conversation at relevant moments throughout today's journey, but for the truly devoted, the full interview can be found in the description and as an end card. Now with that out the way, it's showtime.
I first came across the game maybe back in 2008 or 9 when I first came to Japan. I saw it on a shelf, and the thing that grabbed me about it was a Squaresoft game, and I picked it up and I was looking at the back of it, and I saw an 8.6, which is a very popular car from an anime called Initial D, which I was into at the time. And I was just baffled. It's like Squaresoft made an RPG featuring an 8.6, well, featuring a ton of cars, but that's when you start out with. And why have I never heard of this? Why didn't it come out in the West?
Despite what its title will lead you to believe, Racing Lagoon is an RPG first and driving game second. Unlike the racing games that would become popular and commonplace in the ensuing 2 decades after its release, Racing Lagoon is not a driving game with light RPG elements, but instead a fully fledged JRPG that replaces combat encounters with street races and character progression with car customization. What this unique blend of genre tropes and systems provides is a tried and true structure for an interactive narrative that feels fresh and innovative through its new coat of paint. Take Racing Lagoon's leveling mechanics and character progression for example, or as the game prefers to refer to it, the Get Reward system. Like an RPG's random combat encounters, Racing Lagoon will throw random races at the player as they explore the game's map, and many narrative sections are accompanied by a race or 2 as well. Within all of these races, the player will be assigned a rival, whether that be their sole opponent or one of many drivers chosen for story purposes. If this rival is beaten in the race, the player will subsequently get rewards, or in layman's terms, be able to choose a part to steal from the rival's car. And if said rival manages to come out on top over the player, a part will be stolen from that player's car instead. This system of risk and reward character progression allows Racing Lagoon to stand out, even today, amongst both RPGs and racing games. You see, the modern mashups of driving games and RPGs pretty much all borrow an extremely linear and by-the-numbers progression system from the latter genre, one with skill trees and relatively menial upgrades between levels. Racing Lagoon, on the other hand, didn't have this precedent to go off during development, as this particular fusion of genres was an untested science at the time of its inception. So, for inspiration, the developers at Square looked to the more established JRPG franchises that were in the works at the company. Final Fantasy VIII came out just a few months ahead of Racing Lagoon in 1999, and was clearly one of the games Racing Lagoon looked to whilst crafting its mechanics. The junction system was FF8's divisive replacement of traditional Final Fantasy battle and levelling mechanics. Its use of items to impart new skills onto the characters was unheard of and contentiously controversial at the time of its release. When examining FF8's junction system, it is clear to see the influence Racing Lagoon took from it. The abandoning of traditional levelling and its replacement with what is essentially an item collecting mechanic opened up Final Fantasy VIII's customization when it came to character progression. This non-linear approach to player character growth was adopted by Racing Lagoon, as to allow for players to build their own car in whatever way pleases them throughout the game. These items can be collected through either the Get Reward system or bought at a tune shop in 3 rather self-explanatory categories: engine, chassis and body. In much the same way a Da Vinci or Michelangelo would pore over a masterpiece, combining these car parts both from an aesthetic and handling perspective allows the player to tune and build the car of their choosing. Shit, if you really want, you could be the fastest bus driver in all of Yokohama, drifting a 40-seater through the city streets at 200 miles per hour plus. Though, your fellow street racers might look at you funny. As is probably evident, this Get Reward system allows for a great deal of non-linearity within the way a player interacts with Racing Lagoon and the rest of its systems. Much like character building in From Software's Dark Souls, a player can experiment with different setups for their character and tailor the exact feel of gameplay to their liking, even hindering themselves to make the game harder if they so desire. This non-linearity spills out into other aspects of Racing Lagoon's game design as well. Although the game's narrative is structured rather rigidly into chapters or nights, the freedom the player is granted within these chapters is still rather remarkable. Once a night begins, the player is free to tackle, or not, the various activities available during that chapter, in whatever order they see fit. Whether that be continuing with the story, cruising around the city experiencing all the small pieces of dialogue and monologue at the various visitable locations, or taking part in unofficial races. However, much like the beginning of Dark Souls, the player is left to their own devices in terms of figuring out the order of progression. Unofficial races are just that, unofficial races. Races in which the player does not risk losing a car part to a rival. These objectives are basically Racing Lagoon's side quests. They allow the player to hone their driving skills free of risk and gain new parts or money to spend at the various body shops scattered throughout the game's maps. Although on the surface these races have no noticeable differences from those required by the story, the changing of context surrounding them allows these pieces of gameplay to feel separate from the rest of the activities the player will take part in, and is yet another example of the RPG-esque freedom Racing Lagoon allows its players. For now, let's stay here, in the realm of RPGs, and discuss Racing Lagoon's biggest differentiator from other games in the role-playing genre: its combat, or lack thereof. From the dawn of the genre on early personal computers with titles such as Wizardry and Ultima, combat has been at the centre of the RPG experience, serving as the ultimate catalyst for player character growth and usually the main source of interactivity within the games. Combat, whether turn-based or real-time, has become the default for most games within the genre, even in cases where the game's narrative doesn't exactly call for or justify its inclusion. Only in recent years, and usually relegated to the indie space, have we seen Western RPGs that attempt to do away with the expectation of combat. Games such as Disco Elysium replace the interactable violence with a combat of wits, tasking the player with talking to the game's characters and awarding them with progression only when they make smart decisions during dialogue. On the JRPG side of things, we have older examples, such as Moon Remix RPG Adventure, that quite satirically subverts the expectation of combat by asking the player to clean up after a violence-obsessed stand-in for the usual RPG protagonist. Both of these examples are knowing subversions of the assumption of combat in RPGs, but Racing Lagoon seemingly has no interest in pulling the rug from under the player in this way, and instead sticks with the structure created by a focus on combat whilst changing what combat even means. You see, Racing Lagoon still definitely has a focus on combat, but its fights are not competitions of strength, they're competitions of speed. What I mean is, the races within the game are the combat of Racing Lagoon. In the same way a manga, such as Initial D, retains the bombastic, tension-filled battles of shonen stories through its showcase of street races, Racing Lagoon holds on to the structure and excitement created by an RPG combat encounter through its many moments of motor sporting. Racing Lagoon's wholesale borrowing of the traditional JRPG structure, just with a different gameplay activity covering the combat portions, is undeniably unique, with only a handful of other games ever attempting a similar sort of thing. Thus far, we have focused mainly on Racing Lagoon's RPG side, so let's briefly discuss the other half of this pie, the driving. The most important part of a driving game is the feel. Does manipulating the vehicle you're put in control of have the right heft and precision? A question asked by most when introduced to a motorsporting title. Well, I'm happy to say Racing Lagoon's vehicles feel immaculate to control. And that statement does not need a qualifier. Even 20 years after its release, Racing Lagoon's handling feels AAA in quality. Yes, one can tell the game's age from its controls, which were conceived before the standardization of a controller's triggers representing accelerate and brake, though the face button mappings really didn't hinder my performance on the track. The previously mentioned granularity of the car building systems helps in alleviating any stumbling blocks a player might have with the base controls and car feel, by allowing them to customize a car that they feel more comfortable with. Because, as stated at the beginning of this chapter, Racing Lagoon is not a driving game first, and painting over one part of the RPG formula with driving isn't enough to pull the game from its more traditional roots. Speaking of Racing Lagoon's painting over of classic RPG tropes and systems, let's discuss the game's map and the exploration a player can take part in on it. Although driving and car customization is the core of the game's systems, most of a player's time will be taken up with exploration, a scenario that is certainly not uncommon for JRPGs. Racing Lagoon is different from others in its genre, however, by presenting the player with a more open and urban map to explore from the get-go. Many RPGs and racing games of the time kept the player on a linear path through the game's world, at least for the first few hours or so. But Racing Lagoon allows the player freedom in where to go from the very start. As the first of the game's nights begins, the player will be let loose in the game's first map of a few, and allowed the freedom to explore the city and get to know its characters and locations at their own pace. This player-led pacing helps Racing Lagoon from ever getting too repetitive or feeling like a one-trick pony. If a player feels as though they are bored with side activities or getting through the plot too quickly, they will always have the choice to just cruise and see what the city has to offer.
This game is ambitious, it's different. It takes a lot of weird steps, and that's because it's trying something that's never been done before. People didn't expect Square to put out a game like this. They expect swords and sorcery. They expect increasing your strength and magic and turn-based combat and things like that. But the Square like style of storytelling and the Square aesthetic and things like that can be applied to other games.
Like any good RPG, Racing Lagoon's map and towns do not just serve gameplay, but are also at the heart of the game's narrative and its storytelling structure. Within most traditional JRPGs, towns are used to tell stories adjacent to the main narrative, and are the perfect venue for drip feeding the game's lore to a player. Racing Lagoon is no different. Similar to most in the genre, there are locations spread amongst the map where a player can read monologue from our protagonist, Sho, or experience vignette-style mini-narratives that flesh out the city of Yokohama. But it's in this use of Yokohama as the game's setting where the differences really lie. Racing Lagoon is a rare case of a JRPG using a real-world location as its setting, and, in my opinion, it's all the more fascinating for it. Lore, in most storytelling mediums, but especially games, is used to reinforce the themes of the main narrative, and when a story is set in a location that actually exists and has its own history or lore, the intelligent author will align their themes with the setting's real-world history. Racing Lagoon was clearly created by intelligent authors, as the setting of Yokohama and its history are employed extremely tactfully when it comes to bolstering the game's themes. Themes of rapid growth and decline, living up to the legends of the past, and of course, revival. Yokohama is a port town just south of Tokyo, and was once, briefly, the home of your humble narrator. Being Japan's second largest metropolitan hub, it holds great significance in the country's modern history, mainly due to the fact that it was one of the first ports in Japan to open up to Western trade, and was the site of the signing of the Convention of Kanagawa, a treaty between Japan and the United States that would formally end the island nation's policy of international seclusion. So, in many ways, Yokohama serves as the nation's door to the rest of the world. Perhaps due to its status as an international port, Yokohama is especially multicultural, with a famous and thriving Chinatown district and a history of influence from European cultures. Yokohama really does represent a changing Japan, and is the genesis point for much of the country's signature interpolation of American and European culture and tradition. With all this history in its view, it's not difficult to see why Yokohama was chosen as the setting for a story such as Racing Lagoons. One that, narratively and aesthetically, deals with the Americanization of the country and its rapid cultural evolution towards the end of the 20th century. Within Racing Lagoon's portrayal of Yokohama, a player can really get a sense of the city's history, even if they possess no prior knowledge of it. On the face of it, the city is accurately portrayed, including the iconic Chinatown district, and even its more international population is conveyed through a character like the American transnational. But on a more general note, Racing Lagoon viscerally invokes the rapid pace of city life. There's never not cars zooming their way along the city's streets, many looking to race. Every visitable location has someone or other dropping by to talk to or taunt Sho and the player. And every night, new activities and stories emerge from the city for a player to give attention to or ignore. Despite this frenzied pace and barrage of interactivity, Racing Lagoon's evocation of Yokohama is underlined by an atmosphere of stagnation. Most obviously, this is conveyed through the southernmost tip of the game's South Yokohama map, Bay Lagoon Wharf. This port area, where Sho and his friends from Bay Lagoon Racing Team frequent as a hangout, feels to be in a state of suspended animation. This can be seen, most vividly, through the unfinished skyscraper Bay Lagoon Tower. In an early piece of monologue from protagonist Sho, we come to learn that the tower was being built during the height of Japan's bubble economy. But due to the 1991 stock crash and subsequent economic disaster, construction was halted and never resumed. The tower looms large over the city, both physically and metaphorically, serving as the perfect encapsulation of the unsustainable growth Japan was enraptured in during their bubble era, and the sudden, screeching halt it came to almost 10 years before the game takes place. All over the game's various maps, which cover Yokohama and its surrounding areas, one can feel reverberations of this economic collapse through characters and locations. It seems everyone and everything within Racing Lagoon has been affected by the crash, though to the street racers who take up most of the game's attention, this won't be the only crash they'll have to deal with. As the game and its narrative progress, this theme of dangerously fast exponential growth, its abrupt ceasing, and the mess that leaves in its wake is explored and invoked more and more, both metacontextually and narratively. The character's insatiable appetite for speed not only mirrors sentiments and attitudes of bubble economy Japan, but also serves to link the rest of the game's themes together as the plot moves towards its inevitable fiery end. Now is probably a good time to give a spoiler warning, as we're about to get into the game's plot. If you are yet to play Racing Lagoon and want to go in blind, please skip to the timecode on screen. Okay, now that they're gone, let's get into it. In Racing Lagoon's opening movie, a disembodied narrator tells the player of a legend. 10 years before the game's 1999 setting, there was a street racer in the city known as Yokohama's fastest legend. He was known for his reckless driving and incredible potential for speed. And while not touched on in the intro, this legend did not end happily, and seemingly anyone that got close to the racer would meet a gruesome end behind the wheel. From Racing Lagoon's opening moments, we as players are made acutely aware that the game's plot will centre on the revival of that legend. And with this, the themes of death and rebirth begin to seep into our understanding of the narrative. We see the game's events through the eyes of Sho Akasaki, someone unaware of the role he will play in the coming revival. Sho is somewhere in between your average angsty teenager and the existential heights of 90s era Squaresoft protagonist. He initially is rather nonplussed about the world of street racing, which he is new to at the story's onset. But as the stakes raise and the plot thickens, Sho becomes obsessed with speed and seems destined for a crash. This setup for a story and protagonist are incredibly intriguing, especially with the knowledge of the game's meta-contextual elements and themes, namely the game's allusions to the collapse of the Japanese bubble economy. Obviously, we have touched on the more direct, in-narrative references to the lost decade and economic depression, with Bay Lagoon Wharf and Tower. Though I believe the plot's notable twists and tragedies can be read as allegorical to those dark days of Japanese history, and the corporate attitudes that led to them. Much of the plot's emotional energy is spent on selling to the player the speed-hungry mania that slowly infects a majority of its main cast. A mania that mirrors the profit-mad mindset of mid-80s Japanese moneymen, and the inevitable crashes they will both experience also stand humorously parallel. It's as though the game is imparting a message of the dangers of uncontrollable growth and speed, trying to tell the player such rapid incline has an equally fast, if not faster, decline. As the plot moves towards its conclusion, the atmosphere only gets more oppressive and existential. The kinesthetic thrill of leveling up one's car and gaining speed is not matched with the triumphant tone and player aggrandizing usual for RPGs, but instead player progression is rewarded with a further darkening of the plot's tone and loosening on the grip of reality for its protagonist. Yes, by the game's second half, the speed bug has bitten the player character show, and from the moment it does, the plot takes a major dive in sanity. Though Racing Lagoon flexes its existential muscles right from the start, the beginning hours balance this extremely carefully with the more fun, goofy, and juvenile elements of its story and atmosphere. The events of the plot, however, do not facilitate the continuing of this jovial tone, so by the time the story has really hit its stride, the jokes and gags begin to be overwhelmingly outnumbered by instances of high-minded musings on the nature of revival, the hunger for speed, and other themes tackled within the narrative. In any other context, a work being this unabashedly direct with its themes would turn me off in an instant. Though this was not the case with Racing Lagoon. This is for multiple reasons. One being that most of these moments of monologue, up until the last few chapters at least, are completely optional. A player could choose to ignore or disregard this writing completely and not be lost in the main plot at all. So these pieces of more direct prose do not interfere with the pacing in the slightest. My second reason for leniency is the context surrounding these moments of the game's writing. By the time they take over the storytelling completely, the player is fully aware of their character show's deteriorating mental state, and these rambling rants that only get deeper and more delusional do genuinely feel fitting for the mental state the character is in. My third and final reason is actually the simplest. I just really enjoy the way in which these parts of the game are written. Yes, occasionally the desperate and dire tone of the writing is shattered by an awkward piece of imagery or odd phrasing, but to be honest, these moments actually only add to my enjoyment of the writing. It has a sincerity that is not really seen much in modern games writing, and this sincerity helps to ground the more outlandish elements of the plot in a teenage angst that feels extremely authentic in a way a lot of other games just don't. 'Tis a fine balance indeed, one that Racing Lagoon keeps up for most of its runtime, and one that its lead writer, Motomu Toriyama, would continue to try and implement in the games he would lend his pen to after. Many older fans of Square's output lament the turn towards more vulnerable and self-reflective characters the company made in their games around the turn of the millennium. I, for one, however, have always enjoyed this about the company's work. In this modern day, they are no longer satisfied with relying on archetypes for their characters, and the narratives they craft are all the better for it. In research for this video, I came to understand that much of this shift can be attributed to one Motomu Toriyama, lead writer for Racing Lagoon. Toriyama has worked at Square since 1994, and his penchant for heady concepts and existential themes has seemingly seeped its way into games from the company he didn't even have a direct hand in. His slow rise in the company meant that by the time he was given full reign over a project such as Racing Lagoon, he had carved up a unique voice for himself and the confidence to use it liberally. This is what led to Racing Lagoon's one-of-a-kind writing style and artistic atmosphere. Though most people familiar with Toriyama's signature style probably don't associate it first with Racing Lagoon, but with the more infamous, no, contentious project he would eventually take the helm of. Final Fantasy XIII. Yes, 10 years after Racing Lagoon, Toriyama would direct the ever-controversial 13th installment of Square's flagship franchise. Now, FF13 is a whole can of worms by itself, and I could probably talk about it for hours. So for the sake of brevity, we will only focus on an extremely specific aspect of its writing that it shares with Racing Lagoon: their use of in-game narrative terminology. Okay, this is quite the idea to break down, so bear with me here. A major criticism of Final Fantasy XIII was the density of its in-game terminology, as in the proper nouns created to name the concepts within the game's world. Terms such as fal'Cie, l'Cie, and seath. One doesn't need to know the meanings of these terms for the purposes of today's discussion, but just know these concepts are not explained very well in the games at all, and the frequency in which characters use them can be extremely alienating to new players. Racing Lagoon does a similar thing with its terminology, but the way in which the terms are framed, along with them being far more self-explanatory than FF13's, allows Racing Lagoon to pull off basically the same idea, just far more effectively. In fact, we have already seen the effectiveness of this terminology to leave a lasting impression on a player within this video. During the gameplay discussion, I use terms such as get rewards and unofficial race verbatim when breaking down the game's mechanics, which I believe is a testament to how well they stick in the player's mind and encapsulate the systems they refer to. Outside of their direct use as names for the various gameplay ideas within Racing Lagoon, however, these terms narratively take on a life of their own through their persistent use. What I mean by this is that terms like get rewards are used so frequently by the characters that they become part of the game's vernacular within dialogue, almost like slang the cast use amongst each other. This incorporation of what could have been lore text or tutorials into the way the characters speak is yet another way Racing Lagoon displays its unique writing style. Though this motif is not just used because it sounds cool. In fact, this linguistic device helps to bolster the game's themes surrounding the Americanization of Japan. Even in its original Japanese text, these terms are written in the Roman alphabet and not the katakana alphabet used by Japanese speakers to write foreign words. The use of this foreign alphabet definitely draws attention to itself and implies that these words are actually being spoken in English by these Japanese characters. If this is the case, the use of this motif would be a direct reference to the modern tradition of English words becoming Japanese slang or informal language, a tradition that encapsulates Japan's modern cultural westernization, which itself is an idea Racing Lagoon's narrative seems to be interested in exploring. See the earlier discussion of the use of Yokohama and its history as the game's setting. All of this style and intricate language would be moot, however, if the story did not have engaging and complex characters to convey through these linguistic flourishes. Though luckily, the characters of Racing Lagoon match the rest of the game's quality and attention to detail. Let's focus on our protagonist, Sho, as he, of course, is probably the most fleshed out character within the game's narrative. I think the best way to describe Sho in a sentence is your typical modern Square protagonist thrown into the real world. What is meant by this is that Sho was one of the first in what is now a long lineage of Square protagonists seemingly inspired by early game depictions of Final Fantasy VII's Cloud. Characters who at first come off as moody and closed off, but slowly reveal they are harbouring deep thoughts and emotional torment. These sorts of characters have basically become a cliché for JRPGs in the 25 years since FF7's release. And like many clichés, most uses of this character type miss the mark spectacularly. The unsuccessful deployments of this archetype seem to come across as edgy, whiny, and critically unrelatable. I think this is due to the fact that the worlds in which these characters inhabit are too fantastical and removed from the problems of the real world. With Sho, Racing Lagoon fleshes out this character cliché and deepens its potential by forcing the character into a setting that almost matches our real world. Suddenly, this character type's signature poetic soliloquizing doesn't feel so grating when a player can actually relate to the struggles they are expressing. Sho, despite eventually being thrown into quite the extraordinary circumstances, still has to deal with the problems an actual teenager would, talking to girls, navigating complex friendship hierarchies, and learning how to be a responsible adult in a world that isn't waiting for you. Through these relatable problems, Sho transcends the archetype he initially seems to fall under, meaning that by the time tragedy rears its head within the story, the player actually feels invested in the emotional narrative. Tragedy does indeed strike the young characters of Racing Lagoon, and not least Sho. The previously discussed mania that seems to infect the cast and eventually the protagonist slowly becomes the main focus of the narrative as it reveals that this, in some way, is to do with the revival of Yokohama's fastest legend. As this aspect of the plot becomes ever more prevalent, the relevancy of One Tech, the game's stand-in for international big business and the owners of the aforementioned Bay Lagoon Tower, rises along with it. Over the course of the game's second half, Racing Lagoon and its story slowly reveal their full hand, and the allusions to Japan's late 20th century economic difficulties can no longer just be waved away. We are first made aware of Diablo tuning, an illegal type of car modification that helps drivers in the city reach unthinkable speeds. Though, at the same time, this puts the various car crashes from the story's first half into an even more tragic context. As Sho goes further down the rabbit hole, both when it comes to uncovering the truth and his own mental state, the player is almost led to believe that the legend and its manifestation as a voice inside Sho's head is in some way paranormal or spiritual. Thankfully, Racing Lagoon does not take this easy narrative cop-out, but instead brings the story back down to its grounded roots for an ending reveal that, in my opinion, perfectly wraps up the themes of this sprawling story. Okay, this is your final spoiler warning. We're about to talk through the game's ending, so if somehow you got here and still want to go in blind, then leave now. During the game's final night, our protagonist Sho has seemingly lost his mind to the legend completely. After falling into a violent fugue state, Sho awakes in Bay Lagoon Towers at the headquarters of One Tech, who now, in hindsight, had a suspiciously vested interest in the game's plot. The One Tech execs tell Sho of his apparent true nature. They convince him that he is, in fact, just a small part of the mind of the original fastest legend, who is in a slumber ready to awake. The fastest legend was the creation of One Tech to help them develop a drug called Diablo, the same name as the illegal tuning. Diablo would allow the user to turn off the fear in their brain and hence push the boundaries of their mortal form. Sho is obviously shocked by the reveal of his so-called true nature and falls into another dreamlike state. After awaking somehow out of One Tech's grips, he escapes the now crumbling tower. The tower falls into a fiery wreck, not unlike the ones we have seen before, and one of the One Tech men appears to tell Sho the actual truth. That he was not the fastest legend, but instead just someone who happened to at one point be in the legend's radius, and hence got sucked into this decade-long conspiracy orchestrated by One Tech to test and develop the Diablo drug. All of the friends Sho had lost and the innocence he would never get back was all sacrificed for the interests of this big business. These young men were used and then thrown aside by the pursuit of profit without them even knowing. The passion they had for racing and their lust for speed was turned against them by this capitalist machine. The One Tech guy offers Sho one last race for his freedom. But I just wondered, what's the point? We had already seen the damage this little experiment had had on the city and its people. At this point, a race wouldn't solve anything. So, with the image of the once looming and menacing tower now in a fiery ruin, I put down Racing Lagoon. I didn't need to see any more. Although I do take issue with some of the details of this reveal and the tonal whiplash they cause, I don't despise these concepts at all. I think the use of the main cast and the protagonist as surrogates for the revival of the legend is extremely interesting. The idea that these young men are the tools for which a legend can use to achieve revival not only adds to the narrative weight of the legend itself, but also evokes the ever-relevant idea of younger generations reviving and recontextualizing aspects of the past. An idea that would have been extremely prescient in the lost decade era Japan where Racing Lagoon was set and made. I'm sure at the time the hopes was that the younger generation of 90s Japan would pick up the pieces of the mess their parents' generation had left them. And I believe the framing of this responsibility within Racing Lagoon as a parasite infecting the young characters helps depict the incredible burden such a task must have been. Though this idea is subverted by the ending, with the reveal that OneTech, an allegory for real-life big business and corporate interest, were the secret orchestrators of the entire revival. The game seems to take a cynical stance on the idea. At the end of the day, Sho and his friends were merely puppets for OneTech's research and development, and actually had little to no free will during the revival. So, to me at least, Racing Lagoon seems to be commenting on the co-option of youth culture by big business and the exploitation of young people for profit. Through the multiple versions of the truth the player is told, the concept of revival is explored thoroughly, and the game offers both optimistic and cynical takes on the idea. Though, no matter which of the game's perspectives on revival you prefer, you can't deny that Racing Lagoon's story is rich with thematic depth.
So the thing about Racing Lagoon, the most striking thing to me is that I do get the idea that this is a genuinely underappreciated game. I think this game, with its aesthetic, with its styling, with its kind of out of time look, has the potential to be appreciated more today than it may have ever been when it was released, and in the area that it was released in Japan. I think some of the visuals have gained a sort of semi-ironic appreciation from people. People are now nostalgic for the way this game looks, when maybe in the early 2000s, people would just say that it looked bad. But I think that there's some real potential in this game in bringing it to new audiences.
This concept of revival never ceases to be attached to Racing Lagoon in my mind. The game does, admittedly, use the word to a near comical degree, but I suspect there is a deeper reason. In this video, we have covered the concept within the narrative, both thematically and within the plot. We have also seen the way in which Racing Lagoon revives long stale design tropes of its genre through its injection of speed. However, there is a context not yet touched on in this video, in which Racing Lagoon and its evocation of revival transcends the realm of relatively well written and fun PlayStation 1 RPGs. I believe it was this transcendent quality that allowed Racing Lagoon to be, in itself, revived, and for life to imitate art. So, to close, let's take a look at that art. Before Racing Lagoon's fan translation, the only content an interested non-Japanese speaker had to consume from the title was sparse screenshots or a purely visual journey through the game. So, its reputation in the West very quickly began to centre around the game's visual art style. Upon release in Japan, this art style was one of the most contentious aspects of Racing Lagoon to both players and critics. It was lambasted for its awkward character models and janky cutscene animation. Though, as mentioned in the What is Racing Lagoon chapter, the 2010s saw a surge of Western game enthusiasts recontextualizing art styles like Racing Lagoon's, choosing to see these once laughed at graphics as a knowing and intentional art direction, looking past the technical limitations of the time or even incorporating them into their appreciation and understanding of the style. All one has to do is look to Twitter accounts such as PS1 Aesthetics or Low Poly Depression to see this recontextualization and appreciation in practice. Mind you, this practice of artistic recollection and redefinition has been happening with almost every artistic medium since the beginning of time, and video games have only just started dabbling in it. The early 2010s saw the first wave of this practice within the game's medium, with the popularization of the indie retro throwback. Games such as Undertale and Shovel Knight evoked the technical limitations of the past to reframe an old art style for a new audience. And critically, that audience then went back to play and examine the old games that inspired these new ones. I believe you can draw a direct line between those pixel-style indie games and the resurgence of Racing Lagoon and games with similar art styles amongst Western game players. The most beautiful thing about this resurgence is the fact that it was completely fan-led. In the same way we follow Sho and his friends as they revive the Yokohama street racing scene and the fastest legend, we can now see curious non-Japanese gamers reviving the forgotten aesthetics of the past. I do still believe that this revival would have not taken place if Racing Lagoon's art style wasn't so unique. So let's discuss what makes it visually stand out. With the introduction of the 5th console generation came the full embrace of the third dimension. But like many new technologies, an exact formula for making a 3D video game hadn't been set in stone at this early stage. Due to this lack of design standardization, the late 90s became a renaissance of experimentalism within games as a medium, especially when it came to visual and graphical styles. Square, for their part, had carved out a visual language of their own, one birthed from the habits learned from developing 2D games and from a need for efficiency, with the company sticking to their reputation for creating large, sprawling experiences. The defining ingredient for their formula ended up being the pre-rendered asset. You see, the original PlayStation and its comparable consoles could only render or display an extremely limited number of polygons, the shapes used to make 3D models, on the screen at once. Square's and other developers like Capcom's solution to this hardware limitation was to only render polygons for the important aspects of a given image, such as the characters or animated assets. The rest of the image's elements, most commonly the background, were pre-rendered in development and displayed as flat images during gameplay. What this technique allowed for was large, detailed, 3D-looking environments that took up a tiny fraction of the computing power compared to if these elements were rendered in actual three-dimensional polygons. The real beauty of the pre-render, however, was in its sparing use. By using pre-rendered 2D assets to supplement true 3D ones, those early PS1 Squaresoft RPGs achieved an almost painterly quality. The low resolution of those pre-rendered backgrounds suggested further detail than was probably ever there, and triggered the imaginations of many players. Perhaps that's why those games are still so fondly and warmly remembered even today. Now, if I told you that Racing Lagoon used pre-rendered assets in almost the opposite way and still achieved an iconic art style, would you believe me? Yes, Racing Lagoon is a game made entirely of pre-renders. The characters, the maps, the backgrounds are all pre-rendered. The only thing I can tell that is true 3D are the racetracks and the cars on them. Apart from that, a polygon is genuinely hard to spot. This rampant use of pre-renders is what led to the character models and animation that was so ridiculed at Racing Lagoon's release. Though, as we have covered, these are the elements that would make the game so appealing to its modern fans some 20 years later. There really isn't a game that looks quite like Racing Lagoon, and that is mainly due to this constant use of pre-rendered graphics. This distinct visual language is what I believe helped transform Racing Lagoon into the modern curiosity it has become. Though, in the same way owning some paint does not mean one will create a masterpiece, this rendering technique was never going to single-handedly create an aesthetic for Racing Lagoon. So, let's look to the other aspects of its visual language to understand the game's graphical style better. Racing Lagoon has a few camera angles for which the player will spend a lot of time with, like the isometric bird's eye view of the city that frames exploration, or the more modern rear third-person view during races. Though, the most memorable frames and angles within Racing Lagoon can be found during the story moments. When a player rolls up to a story location, their screen will go black from the usual satellite-style camera, and back up to a meticulously framed collage of pre-rendered assets. Occasionally the player, or viewer in this instance, will be treated to a camera pan, a character fade-in, or a small piece of animation that almost always have the power and subtlety to bring these frames to life. I reckon the majority of the screenshots passed around the Western internet before the fan translation were of these story moments. Their visual novel-esque simplicity, matched with the previously discussed distinctive pre-rendered assets, made them the perfect snapshots of the game's style and atmosphere, and must have intrigued many, if not most, that saw them. Screenshots and visual style, however, were not the only things Racing Lagoon became known for in the West before its fan translation. No. Another noteworthy quality of Racing Lagoon's artistic presentation can be found in its music. Similar to the rest of the game's artistic language, Racing Lagoon's music is an eclectic mix of influences. From hip-hop to jazz to jungle and drum and bass, the sounds of these beats bring to life the frantic rush of Yokohama city living. I can only imagine that Racing Lagoon's modern, real-world setting was liberating for the game's composers, Noriko Matsueda and Takehito Eguchi, who would later collaborate again on the similarly multifarious cult favourite Final Fantasy X-2 soundtrack. The pair, who had previously almost exclusively worked on music for games set in fantasy worlds or the past, clearly had fun making Racing Lagoon's various tracks and sounds. The music they created is at the same time energetic and upbeat, but also woozy and atmospheric, matching the rest of the game's almost bipolar tonal switches. The various motifs and melodies within Racing Lagoon's soundtracks are some of the most memorable aspects of the game as a whole, and after a few hours of play, it is almost impossible to divorce the game's audio and visual styles. I'm no music theorist, so all I can really say on the matter is that Racing Lagoon's music feels right. The emotions those sounds awaken in me feel perfectly aligned with the emotions of the game's narrative, and on a meta-contextual level, the genre blending that its soundtrack commits fits into the wider cultural collage Racing Lagoon as a product is. Our final contributor to this collage of cultural revival is the fashion of Racing Lagoon. Street racing is just as much about looking cool as it is about going fast, and it would seem Racing Lagoon is fully aware of this. Racing Lagoon's entire cast, both main and supporting, all seem to have their own unique style, though they all fall under the game's wider aesthetical umbrella. The street racers, including Sho, Ikki and Akira, all have very similar styles. Staples of their outfits include ripped sleeves and delicate layering, and they also all seem to pull from the Japanese fashion tradition of English words and lettering being printed onto their clothes. The fabric layering almost feels allegorical to the rest of the game's layers of cultural influence, and the typography seems to be an even more obvious nod to this idea of cultural recontextualization and the aforementioned modern American influence over Japanese culture. It's funny as well that in our real-life modern-day world, this sort of lettering and typographical printing seems to have come back into style in Japanese fashion, and has even begun to invade Western streetwear design as well. Look to the modern releases of a streetwear firm such as Supreme to see this style of sleeve printing and logocentrism in action. And I'm not saying that Supreme and their designers even know what Racing Lagoon is, but that both of their influences probably aren't too far apart. Outside of this main cast of drivers, Racing Lagoon plays around with a wide multitude of fashion influences, from traditional Chinese dress with a character like Yui Tachikawa, to a clear inspiration from Japanese streetwear staples encapsulated in a character such as Nanako Aoyama. Actually, I want to focus on Nanako for just a moment. She's a minor character that we don't need to go into too much detail over, but I did just want to highlight her outfit. In fact, more specifically, her jacket. The jacket that Nanako and a few other supporting characters wear throughout Racing Lagoon is known as a sukajan, or souvenir jacket. These now iconically Japanese satin jackets were first made for American troops during the occupation of Japan after the Second World War, and were meant to be souvenirs for those soldiers to bring home. Tailors situated in the vicinity of US military bases would be commissioned by troops to embroider the jackets with intricate depictions of stereotypical Japanese imagery such as dragons or cherry blossoms. But as time moved further and further away from the end of the war, these jackets faded from the memory of American fashion culture, but would slowly start to be appreciated and revived by the youth of Japan, and would eventually become an iconic piece of the country's streetwear history. Then, in another instance of cross-culture recontextualization, these jackets would come back into style in America and the West towards the end of the 2010s, with fast fashion brands such as H&M creating their own bastardized versions of the jackets. As you can see, the Sukajan has had quite the history and impact since its creation, and I believe Racing Lagoon's character designer, Hiroshi Sasaki, was fully aware of this and the ways in which the souvenir jacket's inclusion could help subtly bolster the themes of cultural revival and westernization already present in the game and its narrative. That's the thing that really makes Racing Lagoon's fashion and character design stand out. The fact that every small decision for a character's look seems to reinforce and link back to the game's main themes. In fact, that's what makes Racing Lagoon as a whole so special. It is an extremely focused piece of art. Everything from its visuals, to its writing, to its gameplay are aimed at underpinning its core concepts of revival, Japanese Americanization, and the dangers of speed and obsession. Within the world of fashion, there lies the concept of cyclical trends. Styles seem to die off and experience rebirth in cycles of 15 to 20 years. So it's not surprising that the outfits of the characters of Racing Lagoon seem so current and cutting edge even decades after its release. Perhaps these clothes were the catalyst for the game's wider cultural resurgence in the West. Or it could have been the music. Or simply the novelty of a racing-based, otherwise traditional JRPG. Whatever the reason, Racing Lagoon as a cultural artifact represents a story of revival, both narratively and meta-contextually. When a player experiences Racing Lagoon in 2021, They are not only partaking in the revival of Yokohama's Fastest Legend, but also in the revival of Racing Lagoon itself. Both of these revivals mirror the story of this Toyota Terreno AE86, a commodity unappreciated at the time of its release, being bred with new life by a future group, possessing a level of devotion impossible if it weren't for its original underground status. Though on a wider scale, I believe both Racing Lagoon and the AE86's stories parallel post-crash Japan, a rise from the ashes from seemingly world-ending failure to a bigger cultural force than ever before. Even if it weren't for Racing Lagoon's clear allusions to Japanese economic history and the effects of globalization on the country, the game's metacontextual journey from obscurity to modern relevancy still mirrors Japan's bounce back from their lost decade. However, this journey was never expected, not by Racing Lagoon's creators, its Japanese fans, or even the small amount of English-speaking gamers fascinated with the small amount of the game they could understand. Many a star had to align to get us where we are today, with a fully playable English patch for Racing Lagoon. It took a truly dedicated group of individuals to come along and swing open this game's proverbial doors for non-Japanese speakers everywhere. Without their devotion, the recontextualization of Racing Lagoon from forgotten Japanese exclusive to Western cult hit could have never happened. You see, hindsight has an extraordinary power to allow us to extract new insights from things we believe to be analytically dry. But this hindsight cannot go to work if we begin to forget and let history fade from our memory. So, the importance of preservation cannot be understated. Today, we have examined Racing Lagoon, warts and all. But this would have never been possible if it weren't for the enthusiastic hobbyism of a few dedicated fans who loved, preserved, translated and then gifted Racing Lagoon to us. So I'd just like to thank the translation team, not only for their work on this project, but also for taking time out of their schedule to talk to me for this video. And so, dear viewer, I leave you with this, a plea to keep remembering, to keep looking back, and to keep demanding to play the games of the past. For one day, we may just stumble upon a revival.